issue? Is it racial? Is it training? There's a lot to talk about here. We have some terrific guests to come into the show to talk about it. But before we bring on our guests, I want to take a moment just to kind of set this up for you. Obviously, right now we have the backdrop of the George Floyd trial that's taking place. Derek Chauvin, the police officer who shot and killed, did not shoot and kill, who placed his knee on the neck of George Floyd, ultimately causing his death, is on trial right now for that death. That is taking place in Minneapolis. We have Dwayne Wright, the man who was killed by a police officer just this week after that officer, a female officer, says that she believes she was pulling out her taser and instead pulled out her gun and killed him. That officer, by the way, that female officer, resigned her position. She has been charged this week with manslaughter in that case. We're seeing unrest and violence in the streets of Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, as a result of that. We have a lot of tension kind of on standby in regards to what ultimately may come from the Derek Chauvin trial. There's just a lot happening in that backdrop. So we're seeing a lot happen here. This has obviously been an issue. The issue of Black Lives Matter, the issue of policing in this country has been kind of forefront for the last 18 months or so. Certainly the last year since George Floyd's death, there's been a lot of attention that's been brought to it. I will tell you, though, as a journalist, I've been covering this issue for many years, since 2013. And what's interesting about that is to see the evolution of what's taken place in the way that this story has been covered. So back in 2013, I was covering the issue of no-knock warrants. I was covering the issue of police shootings and the way that police are trained and the way that no-hesitation targets are used in training. I covered the Ferguson riots when those took place and was in Ferguson. I covered what was happening in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And so I have covered this for many years and seen the kind of the progression that's taken place. And what we've seen here in the U.S. has been an evolution, if you will, from an unwillingness to recognize there is a problem at all to now, I think, a willingness to recognize there is a problem. The question is, are those who have kind of taken the forefront of this discussion taken it in a direction that corrects the problem, or do they take it in a direction that makes things more difficult and overly creates racial tension? Are the answers for policing the correct answers that are being put forward? Listen, we may not get to all the right answers today, but what we want to do is ask some of those questions and have some no BS conversation here about what it ultimately means to fix these problems rather than remaining in the cycle that we've been in, because we have been in this cycle for some time and maybe far too long. So let's bring in our first guest. It's Reese Everson, a former congressional attorney, a women's rights advocate, a best-selling author. Reese, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's kind of break down for folks. As I said, I've been covering this issue for a long time, and there's a lot to talk about here, right? The levels and
Absolutely.
The layers of this conversation they're deep and they're vast, right?
Yes.
Let's start with what's happening right now. We have the situation with Dwayne Wright. Now, in this case, you have a police officer who, pulls the wrong weapon, pulls a gun instead of a taser, she claims. I'm not sure this is necessarily, from what I've seen so far, a race issue so much as it is an utter incompetence issue. And certainly, I think the charge of manslaughter is the very least. I think it's appropriate, at least. Maybe it should have even been more severe than that because of the level of negligence in the job. What say you about that case?
Well, here's something that we really have to consider. That in Minneapolis, they could not get through the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd without another Black man being killed by the police. And so I'm starting to ask the question, is it open season on Black America? I'm starting to wonder if there is an issue of state-sanctioned murder taking place and state-sanctioned genocide taking place across our country. I'm concerned. As a woman, I'm concerned that police are using the excuse that they're afraid or they're nervous or they're uncomfortable in the situation. And because of that, they're so panicked that they use the wrong weapon, but they don't expect that the people who that they're pulling over or they're confining wouldn't be just equally afraid for their life and began to run? If I know that there's a tendency for police to get overwhelmed and shoot, is it not okay for me to become overwhelmed and want to flee this experience? And so where we are here, I'm starting to wonder, is there a link to the fact that the CIA has determined that Klan members, the Ku Klux Klan, has infiltrated many of the police departments across our country, and that these people are latently, just kind of walking around in their, instead of in a white sheet, wearing now a blue a blue suit and a badge. These are the questions that make me wonder, is there something more going on? Is this a woman? Is this more than just a woman saying taser, taser, but using a gun that weighs significantly different? Is this really a mistake? I don't think the answers are very pretty at all.
Yeah, I think it's hard to even accept the idea that this was a mistake. I get that, because again, there are a lot of factors, right? As you said, it's a different weight of the weapon that's being used. It's where the weapon is supposed to be kept in terms of the dominant side of the body. There are a lot of issues there. At the very least, you would have to say, this is an officer who should not have been on the job, but had been on the job for, I believe, 20 years, hadn't she?
24 years, and she was in leadership. She was a trainer. She trains she had, the day that she murdered this young man, she actually had a new person on the force with her, and she was doing a training.
So let's talk about the race side of it, because I think you're raising some thoughts and certainly some ideas that are a lot of folks are sharing in those ideas right now, right? That there's something significantly and fundamentally and profoundly wrong with what is happening. It's not a new phenomenon, certainly, but I'm looking at some of the statistical numbers, and I know we have to also put this into context because of the fact that the black population is so much smaller than the white and Hispanic populations are, especially as a combined population. But if I'm looking at the numbers over the last 4 years, for instance, and police shootings, whites are shot and killed by police at a much higher, just raw number, not statistical rate, but at a raw number than blacks are. For instance, in 2020, if we just look at 2020's numbers, there were 457 white people who were shot and killed by police officers, compared to 241 black people, 169 Hispanic people, 28 who were listed as other, and 126 listed as unknown. So we don't know what those were. Again, percentage of population certainly plays a factor here. But is this not, or can the argument not be made that this is an issue of militarized views coming from police? The way that police have been trained for the last 20 years have become increasingly militarized than they were, certainly 20 years ago. And then as a result of trying to treat the so-called war on drugs as the backdrop for why policing would become more militarized, because it's seen as a war on our streets, these military tactics were brought into local police departments. It's not just the black population suffering from death by police officer or shooting death by police officer. So is it just a racial issue, or is that oversimplifying it to make it simply about race?
So what we know is that in the last decade, American police officers have literally gone overseas to learn military style. And this isn't our military. These are our local police departments, and not of always big cities. Small population cities have been sending, as well as large cities, have been sending their police departments overseas to learn military style training. When there are issues, the one thing you'll see rolling into town is armored trucks on the trains. They come in on the train, and you see that when there are any issues. And so what I'm really aware of and concerned about is the military style response, and as you said, police militarization of our police that deal with our communities on a daily basis, when their goal is to protect and serve, but they're armed in a way that is to decimate and to kill. So that's definitely an issue.
Yeah,
is what we're
and
facing
what you
right
just
here
said
in
there.
Black America and outgrowth. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, please continue your thought.
But is what we're facing currently with the multiple repeated killings of African Americans, with their hands up in the air, with their backs turned, is that a outgrowth of the militarization of police militarization? No, and here's the reason why it's so interesting. Because we also have the facts that juxtapose that when police go to whether it's to um, you know arrest or to subdue a person who is Caucasian or white European background, who has been known to be violent, that life threatening tactics are not used. And yet, repeatedly, when that's the case with Black and brown people with far less egregious concerns, keep in mind the charge against George Floyd was that the grocery store believed he had a counterfeit $20 bill. This man's life is gone over $20. However, when you juxtapose that against the young Dylan, what's his first name?
Dwayne
The
Wright.
young man who went into, I'm sorry?
You saying talk about Dwayne Wright?
No, Dylan, the white young man the white man who went, he was
Dylan
about
Root.
20 so Dylan Root went into
Yes.
a church and shot 9 people. And not only was he subdued without using any type of force, even though he had used a military style weapon to kill 9 people in a church, he was then taken to Burger King to get lunch. And the police placed a bulletproof jacket over him to protect him from being harmed. So what we're seeing across the country is that this seems to happen over and over and over. The way in which African Americans, people of color, are being treated when they are interacting with the police, and the fact that from a percentage point they interact with the police at a much higher rate, meaning they're stopped more frequently, percentage wise, as a part of their population per capita. And so we're definitely seeing discrepancies that don't say that this is just about militarization of the police. No, this is intentional, and there's really no other way to look at it than to realize that it's connected to the issue of race in America, which is our country's original sin.
Yeah, you specifically mentioned about that George Floyd, the original call-in was that he had a counterfeit $20 bill. The original, the phrase "I can't breathe" didn't originate with, obviously, George Floyd. It actually originated with Eric Gardner in New York, who was a very similar kind of situation where he was selling loose leaf cigarettes, right, on the street corner, and a police officer who tried in that takedown chokehold move choked him to death. And by the way, that officer was not found guilty of anything. Was ultimately, walked away from that situation. So
correct.
I know what you're saying, and I agree with you. There is without question a severe discrepancy in terms of the overall approach, and it's an approach to, again, the way that those takedowns, those arrests, the brutality is justified because someone may have broken the law or a law. And so the use of force, I know that's come up a lot in the current Derek Chauvin trial, the use of force issue doesn't seem to make sense to anyone at home or the average American who's looking at it saying, how is this supposed to make sense that this is appropriate use of force? What say you?
Oh, absolutely. There's no way that anyone needs to have a full trial, to this magnitude, when we know for a fact that not only did Derek Chauvin place his knee on the neck of Derek Floyd, but that in addition, he took his hand and pulled the back of his pants loop up so that George Floyd's chest was pressed into the ground, and that when he was crying and gasping for air, that he repeatedly said, he couldn't breathe, and then cried out for his mother, and then there was no attempt to resuscitate him at all. The medical examiner said, you know, after they knew that he was in distress, the medical examiner, the medical EMS technician attempted to give aid and was told no. And then, it's just so many issue upon issue about the lack of humanity. And that's really what it boils down to. In this country, I'm under the impression that the Constitution still says that African Americans are 3/5 of a human. It has to still be written there because there's no other way to explain how Blacks are treated in this country. It's like they're not even human.
I think that feeling is echoed by an awful lot of people right now. The question is, why is it not getting better? And I'm gonna we have other guests, so I'm gonna bring in the next guest after this, but I want you to respond to this first. Why is it not getting better? Because you began by saying you couldn't even get through the full year. You couldn't even get through the trial of the officer right now in Minneapolis for the death of George Floyd without another death, another high profile, another, I don't even want to call it head scratching. It's people shaking their heads saying, what are you doing there? Right? And it's not just happening in Minneapolis. It's not just happening in Minnesota. It happens all over the country. And there are people who, even those who would say that they think that some of this is building up into racial division, have to at least acknowledge that how can you not stop killing people in this way? It doesn't make sense. I'll give you the last word on that.
So here's the issue. You ready for this? America has never looked in the face of looked in its mirror, correct? I'm sorry. America's never looked in the mirror and addressed its original sin, which is slavery. America literally brought over people from another continent and enslaved them and then freed them, did not provide any type of restitution, restoration, or reparations. They didn't. And to the extent, and I really want to drive this point home, America has never even studied the effects of racism. So they don't, or the effects of slavery on the African-American population. What we have to keep in mind is that police departments used to be called slave patrols. That's what the former position or former job title for the police department was, slave patrols. And so now we have those same people doing what they call traffic enforcement. Well, what if we have civilians who don't carry weapons doing traffic enforcement? After all, if you're giving someone a ticket for speeding, do you need a gun? No, you could actually do it digitally. We're in the age of technology. So because America has never addressed the issue of slavery, has never looked in the mirror and corrected this wrong, or even tried to do a study about it. Can you imagine having done something to hundreds of millions of people and never even studied what the effects were on that group of people? America has buried its head in the sand and it does not want to acknowledge. And so the issue of race continues to just be the underlying current that keeps sucking and spiraling us down into a very ugly place. And it's not going to go away, no matter how long we just try to sweep it under the rug. It's continued to be an issue. And not just the effects of slavery on African Americans, but the effects of slavery on white people, if the effects of racism on white people and what it's done and created in the minds of white people. These are the things that have to be addressed if we're ever going to move forward.
Reese Everson, thank you so much for your time, your input, and your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's bring in our next guest, Wanjiru Njoya. I hope I'm saying that right. She's a senior lecturer in the law school at Exeter University. And Wanjiru, let me just bring you into the conversation, picking up where Reese left off. But let me ask you a question here that kind of advances this conversation. And that is regarding the movement surrounding this. So we've been talking, how much of that you heard, I don't know, but we've been talking about how we've wound up, with these policing issues. But here we are, we're a year into protests and the real prominent rise of BLM. Corporations across the country giving massive amounts of money to organizations that are supposed to fight for racial justice. So the first question I think some people are asking, and certainly is making a lot of headlines, is all this energy, effort and money actually creating a better situation? And if it's not, why not? Is it just too soon? What say you?
I think the two issues are not linked. The issue of how the police behave and inequality for Black people, those two issues are not linked at all. And the idea that you can reform the police by rioting for racial equality, those two issues are not linked at all. Nobody, okay, talking about the police issue first, nobody wants to live in a police state, you know, where the police shoot first and ask questions later. But that's something we can talk about. How should the police behave? How much power should they have? That's got nothing to do with racial equality. I mean, the whole issue about overweening police, we've seen it even with, at least here in the UK, with the way they're enforcing the coronavirus regulations. It's nothing to do with race. Okay, so coming to the racial inequality issue, which is completely separate, and presumably that's what Black Lives Matter is supposed to be about, right? It's not supposed to be about how do we train the police. It's supposed to be about how can we make Black lives better. Forget rioting, you know, setting people's stuff on fire. What's that got to do with making Black lives better? We've just had a huge research project into making Black lives better that focuses on health, education, training, skills. These are the ways you make people's lives better. And we would all have so much love and respect for Black Lives Matter if they would put the money they raised into education, skills, training, you know, just sending money to African countries. If they would only use the money to do things that actually help to improve Black lives, that would be fantastic. You know, so I just would like to separate those two issues. First, what ought to be done about the police, and second, how can we make Black lives better?
Yeah, let's unpack some of this. So let's start with the last thing you were talking about, which is the Black Lives Matter organization versus the movement, right? So Black Lives Matter as a movement really started many years ago as a push to say there are problems, certainly with policing, but in general, in inequities in society, where we've got to make Black lives matter more, right? And if Black lives don't matter in the justice system, if they don't matter in the economic system, then we have to resolve that. But as an organization, do you think BLM represents any of that? Because there's a lot of headlines right now, as you're probably aware, about the founder of BLM now owning or buying 4 houses worth $3.2 million, and the latest one over $1 million. I mean, are these issues where it discredits the idea of these organizations are meant to make Black lives better, as you just described, make Black lives better, and instead it seems like it's a few people who maybe, I don't want to say they are, but maybe enriching themselves through this process and not actually dealing with problems?
Absolutely, and as long as we're distinguishing between things that are not linked, we can absolutely distinguish between organizations that are founded by activists to promote, you know, whatever it is they want to promote, in this case, Marxist ideology. Okay, so some people get together, they think Marxism is great, and, you know, we want to promote, I don't know, the destruction of capitalism. We want to destroy the nuclear family, you know, whatever they think are important goals for them. So they form this organization. It's called Black Lives Matter. They raise a lot of money, over $90 million last year, as far as we know, because the finances are not clear. And then there's some, I don't know, champagne socialists investing in property portfolios. That is about an organization that has goals of its own that it's pursuing, that has nothing to do with ordinary Black people on the ground just trying to live their lives. The two issues are not linked at all. And it's been absolutely tragic watching all the large corporations and institutions following the organization Black Lives Matter, taking the knee, pouring money. Lots of corporations have given money to this organization because they think, you know, it'll calm everybody down. It's got nothing to do with the reality of actual Black people trying to get on with their lives.
But on a corporate level, do corporations even care? I mean, they pretend they do. That's why they give this money. But the truth is, the money they're giving isn't their own money. It's shareholder money. It's money they set aside and try to write it off their taxes or whatever it might be. But do they really care about making Black lives better, or is it marketing? I mean, it feels to me like so much of what we've seen for the last year is a fraud in terms of that part of the situation. And I appreciate, by the way, very much how you separate these things. It feels to me like a fraud when you have these corporations that sit back and say, well, we care, but they don't ask for a single bit of accountability as to how that money is used. In fact, virtually every major corporation that's given money to BLM says, we're fine with these real estate purchases. We don't care because we believe in the movement. Well, do you believe in the movement? Do you genuinely believe in making changes, or is it just a marketing campaign?
It's a marketing campaign, but in a way you can't blame them for that because it's part of the whole corporate social responsibility movement, which again has been going on for many years. So, they have to signal that they care about the causes that people care about, whether it's the environment or, we're in a climate emergency, or whether it's Black Lives Matter or whatever it is. Sorry, that's...
No problem.
They have to signal that they care about all these things. So you're saying, do they really care? No, of course they don't really care, but in a way they don't have to care. You mentioned their shareholders. The shareholders, they don't want their investments to become embroiled in controversy. They just want a quiet life. In a way, they're paying for a quiet life. So they'll say, okay, people are rioting and we don't want them to riot outside our headquarters, so give them a bunch of money and hopefully they go away. No, it's shameful that they're doing that, but in a way you can't blame them. I mean, I don't want to be too cynical about it, but this is the way the world is turning at the moment. In fact, I wanted to just...
It is the way. It is the way the world is turning at the moment. Last question I would have for you here, though, is let's bring it back to the policing issue. So within Black communities, the polling all shows that when you poll Black communities and you say, do you want fewer police or more police? Virtually all Black communities say more policing. They are not asking for less policing. They may be asking for more responsible policing. They may be asking for changes in the way policing is done, but they are not looking to eliminate police. Do you believe it is a disingenuous call that we keep hearing over and over about abolishing the police and getting rid of them? And is that also part of a disconnected strategy that does not make Black lives better? Last word there.
It's a disconnected strategy. Everybody knows the statistics are clear that the greatest victims of Black violence are other Black people, and that the most unsafe neighborhoods are Black neighborhoods. And the reason they're unsafe is because of other Black people on the rampage. I think everybody knows that. This has been known for years and years. They would like more policing to keep them safer. But I think that it's this fake joining up two issues to do with police reform and to do with Black lives that's causing the problem. And I also wanted to draw the link to the wider institutional framework, which is really important in the language of equality, signaling about making everybody equal, and then not thinking clearly about the price that we're prepared to pay for that. I think that people, if I can summarize, they link things that are not linked, and then they separate issues that actually they should be thinking about more carefully, like, are we being responsible in the way we promote the ideology of equality? That's what is causing all these problems at the root.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Wanjiro Njoya, thank you so much for your time and your not just insight, but your wisdom on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll bring in now our final guest, Daniel McAdams. He is with the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And we wanted to bring him into this because Daniel has talked a lot about policing for a lot of years and covered this issue, pretty extensively. But Daniel, coming into this, let's advance the conversation a little more. So here in the United States, how much of the conversation, I don't know what you've heard, but We've talked about the fact that there is a significant issue in policing. There absolutely is. There's without question a problem when you continually see, and it's not just, as I pointed out earlier, it's not just in the Black community where this happens. There's twice as many white people killed by police officers as Black people in 2020. There's half as many Hispanics who were registered as killed by police officers. It is a problem. It is not necessarily just a racial problem, though there is certainly a disparity that's taking place. So the question for you is, how much of the complexity of this issue is being lost because we have a media that is stoking only the racial component to it and won't talk about anything else?
Well, I would say bingo to that. That's exactly what we're talking about. And it may have been mentioned earlier, but, if you look at the statistics for 2020, when it comes to police killing civilians, it's just slightly over the number of murders, of homicides, just in the city of Chicago for the year. I think in Chicago it was nearly 800 murders in 2020, and I think a little over 1,000 Americans in the entire country were killed by police. So you have to look at it in a broader context. But no, you're absolutely right. This is a media hype that we're seeing because, as we now know from Project Veritas, where they went underground with CNN, if it bleeds, it leads. They admit it. They need to hype this stuff up. They need to get ratings. They need to get people at each other's throats. And they're very good at it. And sadly, most Americans do get their news from the mainstream media. And so they think like they're told to think.
When we look at what is happening, with these numbers of cases, as you mentioned, so we have an issue with policing, and yet media does not want to talk about, by the way, what you just brought up a minute ago, which is that in cities like Chicago, you have unbelievable amounts of violence, and this is violence that is largely perpetuated as Black on Black crime. That is what it largely is, and the reality is it's socioeconomic in part. It is related to the lack of lawfulness and its lawlessness in certain areas because gangs are perpetuating a lot of this violence. Drive-by shootings, kids who are getting killed when they're playing in parks or walking down the street. And so these are serious issues of violence, and yet you would think if you turned on the TV that the only violence perpetuated in America is police on unarmed Black men. That's the narrative. It doesn't fit the reality. And I think because of that, we're seeing a fracturing of people who become increasingly distrustful of each other, and they don't look for answers because they're being told that there are no problems except just this one problem. What say you?
Well, it's great for ratings, though. Look at all of those peaceful protests that blow up stores and burn down buildings and things. That's great media optics, and that's the only thing they're seemingly interested in. No one in the media wants to talk about the origins of the destruction of our cities in the U.S. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that it is predominantly rich white liberals from the 60s on, from the Great Society on, that created a welfare state that rewards people for behaving in a way that virtually in all humankind would have been thought abhorrent, to not take care of your families. It subsidizes women whose husbands leave, and this isn't just Black, but it's white as well, because we certainly see the families without fathers in white communities, but it's very predominant in Black communities. You see the subsidization of bad behavior. Even in just this last year, you've seen the absolute destruction of cities with predominantly white liberals telling us you have to lock everything down. And what does that do? It destroys the entire local community. These jobs and these stores and these places are not coming back. And so nobody wants to talk about the cause because the optics of things burning and blowing up are a lot more exciting.
Well, that's certainly true, but I also think there's another agenda here, and I want to get your take on this. So number one, we have the issue of the language. So as a journalist, as a media guy, I always listen to the things people are saying, right? Listen to the words they're saying, because many times the words they're saying are not actually meant to convey what they're saying. It's meant to set up what they're about to say. And we see that happening a lot right now, I think. But what we're hearing being said a lot right now is reimagine policing. We cannot reform policing. Policing has to go as it currently exists, right? That's the discussion that's being had. What I suspect is about to come is a push for eliminating local police departments and federalizing all police departments so that it answers directly to Washington. Is that, in your opinion, part of the play that's being made here to say we can federalize the entire police force of the United States, and therefore those who are in Washington now control policing all the way down to the local level? And they're utilizing a narrative of police are the problem and cannot be reformed as a means to an end. What say you?
No, I think that's a very good supposition. We're certainly seeing the centralization of power like we've never seen it before. It's certainly something that I would not be surprised to see happening. But it would be a nightmare for people in the inner cities. It would be, imagine, the National Police Department is incompetent as a DMV or something. It would be an absolute disaster. But in the current environment, as you point out, the use of language, the way language is being distorted, it will be sold as a good thing. The narrative of the incompetence of people like Mayor Lightfoot in Chicago and elsewhere. She can't seem to get a handle on it, so let's bring in the feds. Certainly, it's a scenario that you could imagine happening. It would be, again, a nightmare for people.
And I think one of the issues that to me really stands out about a lot of this is, you have all these folks who were saying, people like former President Barack Obama, Ayanna Pressley, who are utilizing this terminology, like I said, that policing cannot be reformed, right? You can't fix it. And yet they're not offering a single solution to fix it, right? Where are the actual solutions that have been attempted to fix policing? I believe, and as you know, I've been covering this for a long time and talking about this for many, many years. I believe there are significant issues with policing that do have to be fixed, including the fact that it's over-militarized, ending the war on drugs and the militarized war on drugs. That would solve a lot of the policing problems. And then the last one is policing for profit. But one thing that we are not recognizing in this country on a public scale is that police departments have been used as a means for revenue in cities across the country, and it's still happening today. Traffic tickets that are issued, forfeit seizure, where you go in and you take someone's stuff because they're suspected of a crime, and you take their money and you take their things. Right? This happens all over the country. And there are cities across the country that have line items in their budget that are based upon how much revenue is brought in by police departments. Well, the only way a police department brings in revenue is to come in and take it from someone or to punish them and issue fines for them. Why are those issues of policing, which I think are significant and profound, completely ignored? I'll give you the last word here.
Well, because they don't sell well on CNN. That's the problem. But you're absolutely right. You want to talk about the drug war. You want to talk about asset forfeiture, which is a disaster. You see police officers driving in some sort of $50,000, $100,000 car saying, I got this from a drug dealer, and all of this sort of thing. There are deeper problems. There is a problem with policing in the United States, but it's not going to be discussed in the current climate, where the intent of the elites is to divide and conquer, to divide among the races, divide among the rich and the poor. This is how they gain power, and they're very successful at it right now.
They absolutely are. Daniel McAdams with the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Guys, that is our podcast for today. And, before we go, I just want to say some of the things I brought up a minute ago. These are very real issues that need to be dealt with, that must be dealt with in this country. But unfortunately, when we turn everything into an us against them, racial component, and that's not to say that racism doesn't exist, and it's not to say there isn't a racial component built into police training. I believe that there is as well. But when we hear politicians say that these institutions are beyond reform, what they're really saying is we're not going to deal with the systemic problems. We just want to remake it in our image. That's what we have to worry about. That's what we have to caution against. Guys, again, thanks for watching. I'm Ben Swann. We'll see you back here next week with a whole new episode. See you then.